Point number 1, with the death of Viserys Targaryen I in Season 1, the opening credits have been changed from being based around his miniature model of all Valyria to an elaborate embroidery, which makes me think of Queen Helena Targaryen, since she does a lot of embroidering. This embroidery depicts various moments throughout Targaryen history, starting with what appears to be the creation of dragons. These two figures might be blood mages performing blood magic and combining parts of various creatures together. The result is a creature with a tail resembling that of a lion, a body with both fore and hind legs, a head that could either be human or just has silver Valyrian hair, and finally wings of fire. The theory that Valyrians used other creatures to create dragons isn't a new thing, as in the World of Ice and Fire, an IRL book representing an in-universe book written by Maester Yandel, he states, in Septim Baths, Dragons, Worms and Wyverns, he speculated that the blood mages of Valyria used wyvern stock to create dragons. Though the blood mages were alleged to have experimented mightily with their unnatural art, this claim is considered far-fetched by most maesters. Among them, Maester Vanyon's Against the Unnatural contains certain proofs of dragons having existed in Westeros even in the earliest days, before Valyria rose to power. Also, in A Feast for Crows, Book 4 of A Song of Ice and Fire, the kindly man tells Arya Stark about the fireworms of Valyria. Some say they are akin to dragons, for worms breathe fire too. Instead of soaring through the sky, they bore through stone and soil. If the old tales can be believed, there were worms amongst the 14 flames even before the dragons came. The young ones are no larger than that skinny arm of yours, but they can grow to monstrous size and have no love for men. So it could be possible that the blood mages of Valyria used both wyverns and fireworms in their creation of dragons. Not entirely sure who these two figures are meant to be, though from what I've seen on Reddit, most people believe the woman is Daenerys Targaryen, also known as Daenerys the Dreamer, as she had a prophetic dream of Valyria being destroyed. Her father, Aenar Targaryen, believed her, and in 114 BC moved his entire family and 5 dragons, one of whom was Balerion the Black Dread, to Dragonstone. Rival dragon lords viewed the Targaryens leaving Valyria as cowardice, but 12 years later, 102 BC, the doom came to Valyria, leaving the Targaryens as the last surviving dragon lords. We then see the doom of Valyria, Aegon the Conqueror flying with his sister wives Rhaenys and Visenya on their dragons, Balerion the Black Dread ridden by Aegon, Meraxes ridden by Rhaenys, and Vhagar ridden by Visenya. Yes, the very same Vhagar in this show who was the mount of Daemon Targaryen's wife Laena Velaryon until Laena died and was then claimed by Aemon Targaryen, son of Viserys Targaryen I and Alicent Hightower. The sister wife of Aegon the Conqueror, Queen Rhaenys Targaryen, is not the same character as the Princess Rhaenys Targaryen in this show, however. We then see what appears to be the burning of Harrenhal, though it shows 2 dragons engulfing the castle in flames, one green, one black. The black dragon is most certainly Balerion, and the green must be Vhagar, since Meraxes' scales were silver. This could either mean, in the lore of the show, both Aegon and Visenya burned Harrenhal, or it could just be symbolising the current conflict between the Greens and the Blacks and all the people caught in the middle of it. Next we have Queen Regent Shara Arryn and her son the Boy King Ronald Arryn with their Falcon sigil, King Torrhen Stark with his Direwolf sigil, and Lord Edmund Tully with his Fish sigil, all bending the knee. The Arryns became the Wardens of the East and Defenders of the Vale, where Visenya bypassed all of Shara's army by landing Vhagar in the Ares courtyard, then taking Ronald for a ride on her dragon when he asked his mother if he could fly with her. This led to him being nicknamed the King Who Flew. The Starks became the Wardens of the North, and now Lord Torrhen Stark thereafter became known as the King Who Knelt, and Lord Edmund Tully was named Lord Paramount of the Trident for siding with Aegon the Conqueror against Harrenhal, King of the Isles and the Rivers, whose seat was Harrenhal. After the crowning of Aegon as Lord of the Seven Kingdoms and the resigning of Orys Baratheon, rumoured half-bastard brother of Aegon, Lord of Storm's End and Lord Paramount of the Stormlands, as Aegon's hand, Edmund took up the role for 2 years before resigning himself. Lord Ronald Arryn also ended up marrying one of Torrhen Stark's daughters due to an arrangement by Rhaenys in an attempt to knit the new Seven Kingdoms together, though Lord Torrhen Stark was unhappy with the match and his sons didn't attend their sister's wedding. The figure we then see sat on the Iron Throne with a spike through their neck and bleeding from their wrists is that of Maegor Targaryen I, more commonly known as Maegor the Cruel. A son of Aegon the Conqueror from Visenya, he forcibly took the throne after Aenys Targaryen I, son of Aegon from Rhaenys, died even though the crown should have passed to Aenys' son Aegon, who were going to be known as Aegon the Uncrowned. Maegor ruled Westeros as a tyrant for 6 years and 66 days before being found dead on the Iron Throne by his queen Elenor Costane, one of Maegor's 3 Black Brides. A spike had gone through the back of his neck and out of his throat, and his wrists had been cut, but the mystery of was it chop suey or murder and who could have murdered him was never solved. Maegor was succeeded by his nephew King Jaehaerys I, the Consolator, the Wise, the Old King, and who we next see in the embroidery standing beside his sister queen, Good Queen Alysanne. The embroidery has now caught up to when the show began, showing us King Jaehaerys I holding the Great Council at Harrenhal to determine who should succeed him, his granddaughter Rhaenys or his grandson Viserys. The vote ended up in Viserys' favour, and Rhaenys became known as the Queen Who Never Was, though in the books Jaehaerys didn't actually attend the Great Council, but accepted and endorsed the vote when he was told the results. We then see Alicent making her grand entrance in her green dress at the wedding of Rhaenyra Targaryen and Laenor Velaryon, son of Rhaenys and Corlys Velaryon, from Season 1 Episode 5, which then leads to showing us the greens and the blacks divided. On the one side we have Prince Daemon, Princess Rhaenys and Corlys, and also Rhaenyra's sons from Sahara Strong, Selena Velaryon, Jacaerys, Lucerys and Joffrey. And on the other we have Sir Otto Hightower, father of Dowager Queen Alicent and hand of the king to Aegon II, Sir Criston Cole, Lord Commander of the Kingsguard, Prince Aemond, Aegon II, and his sister queen Helena. Next we see both Aegon Targaryen II and Rhaenyra Targaryen I crowned, Aegon on the Iron Throne and Rhaenyra on the Dragonstone Throne. While the hand beneath Rhaenyra is reaching towards 3 dragons, 2 of whom I assume are Syrax, Rhaenyra's dragon, and Caraxes, Daemon's dragon, also known as the Bloodworm. I'm however not sure which dragon the third could be. The hand on Aegon's side however appears to be reaching towards 5 black shapes which to me look more like birds than dragons. Could they possibly be ravens? And taking into account the saying dark wings, dark words, could these 5 ravens then represent 5 deaths yet to come for the Greens? Finally, we see the most recent major event to happen in Targaryen history, the death of Rhaenyra's son Lucerys Velaryon and his dragon Arrax at the jaws of Vhagar, being ridden by Aemond One-Eye Targaryen. Point number 2, Cregan Stark reveals that his ancestor Torrhen Stark, the last king in the north who bent the knee to Aegon the Conqueror and thereafter became known as the King Who Knelt, would use decimation to decide who to send to the wall. Decimation here being used in the ancient Roman fashion of singling out 1 man in 10, though for the Romans this was so that then that 1 man would be murdered by the other 9 as a form of punishment for the whole group. Here however 1 man in 10 is sent to man the wall rather than murdered, but even though Cregan says
this is not a sentence but an honour,
I would wager some would prefer death over spending the rest of their lives freezing cold and not being allowed to have a woman warm their bed at night. Point number 3, Cregan tells Jacaerys that his father Rickon Stark brought King Jaehaerys I and his sister Queen Alysanne to the wall, though in the books it was actually a much earlier ancestor, Alaric Stark. Also considering Cregan says Jaehaerys and Alysanne's dragons at Vermithor and Silverwing refused to fly over the wall, I guess David Benioff and D.B. Weiss just forgot about that when they had Daenerys and her 3 dragons, Drogon, Viserion and Rhaegal, fly over the wall in Game of Thrones Season 7. Point number 4, rather than Daemon calling Vhagar a hoary old bitch, in Fire and Blood it's actually Jacaerys who says it and not till later during the dance. Point number 5, Daemon references how Rhaenys didn't have Malaise burn Aegon and everyone else standing with him when he was crowned king at the end of Season 1 Episode 9. The reason she gives to Daemon and Rhaenyra in Episode 10 of Season 1 was that it wasn't her war to start, so she chose to do nothing. I wonder if Rhaenys will face another similar choice in the future, and if she again will choose to do nothing or instead do something. Point number 6, without spoiling anything, I'll just say the characters of Alyn and his brother that he mentions are major characters from Fire and Blood, with Alyn also having been mentioned in books 4 and 5 of A Song of Ice and Fire, A Feast for Crows and A Dance with Dragons respectively. In the books however, Alyn and his brother never served in the Valyrian fleet, but on the 7 ships belonging to their mother, Merilda, and Alyn never saved Corlys' life during the War for the Stepstones, as the war actually ended the same year Alyn was born, 115 AC. Point number 7, we see more of Helena's prophetic abilities that are exclusive to the show, and it makes me wonder how much of the future can she actually see? Can she actually see what's going to happen, or is she just seeing an interpretation, like is she just seeing literal rats, or is she just getting a feeling she has with no actual visions? And if it is the case that she can see what's going to happen, why does she never try to do something to prevent it, or avoid it? I agree with Aegon, Helena really is a mystery. Point number 8, impossible as it is to believe, in all the books that cover the period of the Dance of the Dragons, no account ever confirms, hints at, or even speculates on there being a relationship between Alicent and Criston Cole. Point number 9, in the books Rhaenyra never went off with Syrax on her own to try and find Lucerys' remains near Storm's End, and rather than his wing, only Arrax's head and neck washed up. The dwarf court jester Mushroom, who at this point would be serving under Rhaenyra and whose account of the Dance of the Dragons called the Testimony of Mushroom is referenced extensively in Fire and Blood, claims that Lucerys' corpse also washed up on shore. Aemond then found Lucerys' corpse and removed his eyes to make them a gift to Maris Baratheon, one of Lord Boris Baratheon's 4 daughters, the 4 Storms, on a bed of seaweed. Writer of Fire and Blood, Archmaester Gildane, since the IRL Fire and Blood book is meant to represent an in-universe book of the same name, says Mushroom's claim is excessive and that Grand Maester Munken's book, The Dance of the Dragons A True Telling, gives it, along with the claims that Vhagar snatched Lucerys off of Arixit's back and ate him whole, or that Lucerys survived his fall into the ocean and washed up onto shore having lost his memory, going on to spend the rest of his life as a simple-minded fisherman. No respect whatsoever. Point number 10, good thing none of the people fishing felt such loyalty to Aegon that they'd risk trying to kill Rhaenyra because all it would have taken would be an arrow or a bolt. Point number 11, I'm not sure really who's at fault here, Aegon or Otto. You could say Aegon for just making quick decisions without seeking advice from his hand first, but you could also say Otto for not learning what the petitions were going to be beforehand so he could brief Aegon on what the best course of action would be. Actually, thinking about it, the fault does lie with Otto. How did he not predict that Aegon would make rash, uninformed decisions after seeing how he acted during the small council meeting, when advised he would need to be patient and cunning? Point number 12, again without spoiling anything, I'll just say Hugh here is a major character for Fire and Blood. What he's doing being in King's Landing in the show though, I don't know, since in the books he lives on Dragonstone. Point number 13, in Fire and Blood it's never said that Rhaenyra told her council that she wanted Aemon dead. Instead, Rhaenyra received a message from Daemon, who was already at Harrenhal, saying an eye for an eye, a son for a son, Lucerys shall be avenged. Daemon then sent word to Mysaria, who was still in King's Landing, using her as a go-between to find suitable people to carry out this murder. Point number 14, Lady Jane Arryn in Fire and Blood asked the same thing of Jacaerys, dragons to protect her from the skies, according to Munken's true telling, despite a dislike for Daemon and how he treated his first wife, Rhea Royce. Mushroom, however, claims Jane offered allegiance to the Blacks only if Jacaerys could make her orgasm with his tongue. And Septon Eustace, whose book, The Reign of King Viserys, first of his name, and The Dance of the Dragons that came after, which Gildane also references throughout Fire and Blood, mentions the commonly believed rumour that Jane Arryn was in fact a lesbian, or at the very least bisexual, before saying the rumour wasn't even true. Though I will mention Jane never married and died in the arms of her dear companion, Jessamine Redfort. Point number 15, in the Grand Sept, Alicent lights a candle and says the name Alary Florence, her mother's name, which is unique to the show as she was never named in the books. Point number 16, so in this point I'm just going to cover everything that was different between the show and Fire and Blood for this whole blood and cheese segment. Obviously, since Daemon was at Harrenhal and using Mysaria to arrange the avenging of Lucerys, that means he never snuck into King's Landing. Blood was a former sergeant of the City Watch, having lost his gold cloak when he beat a whore to death whilst drunk, and was instead now working as a butcher. While in the show, Blood agrees to Daemon's plan because he hates the Hightowers, and Cheese accepts in return for gold to pay off his gambling debts. In Fire and Blood, the only motive given is that of a reward if they deliver the victim's head to Daemon. And though Cheese says he knows Maegor's tunnels better than his own cock, in Fire and Blood the quote is attributed to Mushroom in regards to Cheese knowing the Red Keep as a whole. Daemon tells Blood and Cheese to find and murder Aemond in the show, but in Fire and Blood no specific target is named, though since the pair wait in a specific room for the arrival of Helaena and her children, it can be assumed they were specifically ordered to murder one of her sons. Presumably this is the answer to Cheese's question in the show of what he and Blood should do if they can't find Aemond. They should just kill any of the traitor royal family's sons they might discover. There's no mention of Blood and Cheese and Cheese's dog apparently of having to pass through the Red Keep's Great Hall right under Aegon's drunk nose, nor right under King Viserys I's stone nose. No confrontation between Blood and Cheese is mentioned in Fire and Blood, as Buck Cheese is made out to know exactly where he's going, where all the rooms are, and who would be in which room at what time. And that room is Alicent's room in the Tower of the Hand, which she moved into after becoming Dowager Queen. In Fire and Blood, Blood and Cheese used the tunnels to get into her room, and Cheese bound and gagged her whilst Blood strangled her bedmaid. Which in the show is what I thought was going to be the fate of this woman with the very prominent black eyebrows. Reminds me of Emma Stone in Poor Things. They knew that Helaena always brought her children to see Alicent before bed, so Blood and Cheese waited for them to arrive, and when they did, Blood killed her guardsman and Cheese grabbed her youngest child, Maelor. Which brings us to the fact that by this point in her life, Helaena actually had 3 children, 2 boys and 1 girl, twins brother and sister Jaehaerys and Jaehaera, aged 6, and her youngest son Maelor, aged 2. The show, however, only shows us Helaena having 2 children, Jaehaerys and Jaehaera, who look so alike Blood can't tell them apart and has to ask Helaena which one is the boy. This is quite different from Fire and Blood, where the question isn't which one is the boy, but instead, which boy do you want us to kill? Show Helaena appears to actually point them to the great child to murder, which just sounds so wrong of me to say, whereas Book Helaena chooses for them to murder her youngest Maelor, either because the boy was too young to understand what was going on, or because Jaehaerys was Aegon's firstborn son and heir, but instead of killing Maelor, Blood decapitates Jaehaerys and the pair flee with his head, leaving everyone else unharmed. And as I said, Book Alicent was present for all of this, bound and gagged, not off making the beast with two backs like Show Alicent is with Kristen. Point number 17, fuck Cheese for kicking his dog, I hope he dies a horrible, painful death. Point number 18, did Helena like hypnotize Cheese or something into believing that she was pointing to her son? And why did she point them to Jaehaerys since it now leaves Aegon without an heir? Does she hate her brother husband that much, or is it all part of some other vision prophecy thing that she's seen? To round all this off, my most disliked part of the episode goes to hot take the whole Blood and Cheese segment, due to how different and in my opinion worse it is compared to how it happened in Fire and Blood. The only reason I can think of why they dumbed it all down so much for the show, with no tied up Alicent, no strangled bedmaid, no murdered guardsman, no awake frightened children, no Helena choosing her youngest to die, and no Blood decapitating the other son instead, and no hysterically screaming Helena, was because if they tried to have all that stuff, it would be just too traumatizing to watch, like even more traumatizing than watching the Red Wedding, Shireen burning alive, Emma being cut open and murdered trying to save the baby, and they wouldn't be allowed to air it. And my most liked part of the episode goes to how Aegon acts throughout this episode. Not like how the actor acts, but how the character acts, with Helena when asking where Jaehaerys is at the small council meeting, though I think he was going too far when he was going to have Tywin give Jaehaerys a pony ride, when interacting with the small folk who have come to petition him, and when he's drinking with his buddies on the Iron Throne. It'll be interesting to see how the death of his firstborn son and heir affects how he acts in the coming episodes. Point number 1, oh, just your girl Alicent? Just Helena? I mean, I know she was the one threatened by Cheese and witnessed Jaehaerys being decapitated, but don't you also care at all how this might be affecting Aegon, your son, the guy currently freaking out and breaking Viserys' diorama? Point number 2,
And where were you?
I was abed, your grace, having ordered the Night's Watch.
I'm bad!
and where were you, Horace Slughorn? I was a chair. A chair! Point number 3, according to Fire and Blood, Blood actually tried to leave King's Landing 2 days after murdering Jaehaerys and was then tortured for 13 days, giving up who hired him and who his accomplice was. And since he was hired by Daemon through Massaria, who was still in King's Landing, the Goldcloaks searched for both her and Cheese but found neither. There is also no mention of Aegon killing Blood himself, just that after 13 days of being tortured by Larys, he was finally allowed to die. Point number 4, it's nice to see how Show Rhaenyra has a fondness for Helena just like Book Rhaenyra, who calls Aegon and Daemon half-brothers but refers to Helena as her sweet sister. Point number 5, there's no mention in Fire and Blood of Daemon and Rhaenyra having an argument over him playing a part in the death of Jaehaerys and how it weakens Rhaenyra's position. Point number 6, Daemon really must be getting sick of being constantly accused of wanting to steal the crown from whoever it is that is currently wearing it, since he gave up his crown as King of the Narrow Sea to Viserys in Season 1 Episode 4, put his brother's crown back on his head when it fell off in Season 1 Episode 8, and as he reminds Rhaenyra here, put the crown on her head in Season 1 Episode 10, though he can't really be that surprised people would mistrust him since he's done so many things throughout his life to foster that mistrust. Point number 7, so Rhaenyra's not willing to put her son Jaehaerys in harm's way by letting him keep an eye on King's Landing, but she's perfectly happy sending Baelor, his betrothed, to do it instead. Something she doesn't command her to do in Fire and Blood, or rather can't, since Baelor is only 13 and her dragon moon dancer isn't large enough yet to fly whilst carrying someone. Point number 8, I like Helena's nod to herself after Aegon walks by without saying anything, like she's thinking, yeah, that's just what I expected from him. Point number 9, God, the hypocrisy coming out of Kristen Coleslaw's mouth. No wonder he's the most hated character in the show right now. Though I will say, just make sure you separate the character from the actor, since Fabian Frankel has had to limit comments on his social media due to people harassing him over stuff Kristen's done in the show. Point number 10, it's funny how Aemon says here he's proud Daemon sees him as such a threat and how his uncle is scared of him, when in Fire and Blood, Aemon bangs on about how Rhaenyra dying doesn't matter, it's Daemon who is the real danger, and that if he died, Rhaenyra would lose all of her allies and support. Point number 11, Sylvie saying how when princes lose their temper it's often the small folk who suffer, reminds me of a similar quote from Varys to Ned Stark in A Game of Thrones, the book not the show. Why is it always the innocents who suffer most when you High Lords play your Game of Thrones? Point number 12, with Massaria saying she has no interest in betraying Rhaenyra and Rhaenyra not believing her, Massaria gives a speech akin to another quote from A Game of Thrones, this time from Jorah Mormont to Daenerys Targaryen. It is no matter to them if the High Lords play their Game of Thrones so long as they are left in peace. Massaria essentially says the same thing to Rhaenyra, that it was foolish of her to want to be influential and important, and after realising that, she now just doesn't care about the war between the Greens and the Blacks, she just wants to go free and live her life in peace. though Rhaenyra seems to have her own opinion on Mysaria wanting to stay out of the spotlight by pointing out her neck scarf from when she used to wear a slave collar. Rhaenyra, in my opinion, seems to be saying to Mysaria by pointing out her scar, you once were forced to be powerless by being a slave, then through hard work and sacrifice you became powerful, but now you're choosing to be powerless again? Are you sure that's what you really want? Point number 13. Poor lonely sea smoke abandoned by Laenor when he and Sir Carl Corrie ran away to Essos together. At least in Fire and Blood, Seasmoke being riderless was because Laenor had actually been murdered by his lover, Carl, in Spicetown on Driftmark. Point number 14. Ding dong, Cheese is dead. Glad he got what was coming to him for kicking his dog. Oh, and also for killing a kid. Speaking of his dog, hey Cheddar, you Gouda boy, you're free now, doggo. Point number 15. In Fire and Blood, Otto never got angry at Aegon for ordering all of the rat catchers hanged. He actually brought in 100 cats to replace them. That probably explains why there are so many feral cats when it came time for Syrio Florel to task Arya Stark with catching one. Point number 16. Krispy Kreme was made hand in Fire and Blood after Otto was summoned to the throne room and with Aegon ignoring his mother's support for Otto to remain hand. Also, Otto was stripped of his handship, not because he kept insulting Aegon, but because Aegon saw him sending letters and being patient as him sitting around doing nothing.
I wish to spill blood, not ink,
as Aegon says to him in both the book and the show. And Kristen wasn't made hand because of his plan to send Arik to kill Rhaenyra whilst pretending to be his twin. In fact, Arik is sent after Kristen is made hand. Point number 17.
He made me king.
Is that what you think?
Ooh. Point number 18. Tossing the hand pin just like Ned Stark and Tyrion Lannister before him. Or after him? You know what I mean. Point number 19. Aegon saying Otto is dismissed as he was already leaving is like the reverse of someone being fired and saying, you can't fire me, I quit. Also, gotta love Otto leaving the door open just to annoy Aegon even slightly. Point number 20. So, in Fire and Blood, two tales are told of how the duel of the twins happened, one by Grand Maester Monken and the other by Rhaenyra's dwarf court jester Mushroom. Monken says that just like in the show, Arik was tasked with finding and murdering only Rhaenyra, but when the twins crossed paths, with singers claiming that Eric said, I love you brother, and Arik said, and I you brother, as they drew their swords, they fought for almost an hour. The duel came to an end when the twins dealt each other mortal blows and they died in each other's arms. Mushroom, however, claims Arik's targets were Rhaenyra's sons Jacaerys and Joffrey, and that when the twins encountered each other, they called the other a traitor. They then fought, with Eric cutting off Arik's sword arm, but Arik managed to stab his brother in the stomach with a knife. The whole fight lasted only moments instead of an hour. Arik died from losing his arm, but Eric lived another 4 days before dying of his stomach wound, screaming and cursing his brother the entire time. I like how the show gives us a third version of the duel whilst incorporating elements from both Monken's and Mushroom's accounts. The fight only lasts moments, both accusations of betrayal but also brotherly love are spoken, Arik dies in his brother's arms, and while Eric survives, he chooses to fall on his own sword out of grief for killing his twin. I was actually wondering if the fight was going to end with Arik surviving and him walking towards Rhaenyra saying your grace was him pretending to be Eric in a last-ditch attempt to kill her, only to then end up getting killed himself by Sir Lawrence. Point number 21. I'm willing to bet it'll be revealed Mysaria warned Eric that his twin was on Dragonstone since, she passed Eric on the way to the harbour, and then Mysaria will tell Rhaenyra she's thought about it and has changed her mind about not wanting to be influential and powerful and she'll join the Black Council. Point number 22. In Fire and Blood, Otto never leaves King's Landing to go to Old Town after being removed as Hand of the King. Point number 23. Daeron name drop. This is the first time he's been mentioned in the show outside of him being referenced by his cup token appearing on a cogwheel in the opening credits of season 1. Point number 24. Neat callback to the beginning of the episode when Alicent says she's being punished and doesn't answer when Otto asks her for what sin, only now when she wants to tell him what the sin is, he says he doesn't want to know. Point number 25. Nice mothering there, Alicent, ignoring your crying son to go and get some Kristen cock instead. You could learn a lesson or two from Rhaenyra about how to comfort an upset son. To round all this off, my most disliked part of the episode goes to the character of Kristen, and by dislike I mean the writers are doing a very good job of making him a very dislikable asshole. I really hope he gets put in his place soon. And my most liked part of the episode goes to the Duel of the Twins. The show did a much better job in my opinion of adapting this from Fire and Blood than it did the whole blood and cheese stuff in the previous episode. Point number 1. So the part of the tapestry depicting Aemond on Vhagar killing Lucerys on Arrax has now changed to a sleeping Jaehaerys who gets decapitated by golden thread, followed by a depiction of all the hanging rat catchers. Point number 2. While it appears in the show that the Battle of the Burning Mill began because of a squabble between Bracken and Blackwood boys, with both Aaron Bracken and Davos Blackwood being show exclusive characters, in Fire and Blood, House Blackwood siding with Rhaenyra sent raiders into Bracken lands and the Brackens siding with Aegon amassed an army to strike back. As the Bracken army camped by a riverside mill, they were attacked by the Blackwoods and they battled for hours as the mill burned. House Bracken was defeated, and when they fled back to their seat Stonehenge, they found it taken by an army led by Daemon, who by this point in the book already occupied Harrenhal, which is close to Stonehenge. And unlike in the show where Aegon thinks of the battle as a good thing, in Fire and Blood the Bracken's defeat at the burning mill and the loss of Stonehenge was one of the reasons why he removed Otto as Hand. Point number 3, speaking of the Hand, oh my god, why isn't Rhaenys Rhaenyra's Hand of the Queen? She's the only one who speaks any kind of sense to Rhaenyra. Point number 4, if hearing the name Grover Tully makes you think of the character Grover from the Muppets, that's intentional since George R.R. Martin named a number of House Tully after Muppets, with Grover, his grandson Elmo, and his great-grandsons Kermit and Oscar. Point number 5, with her dad, her last ally, gone, even Kristen is now able to undermine Alicent. I guess supporting her in the bedroom doesn't also extend to supporting her in the small council meetings. Point number 6, I called it that it was Mysaria who warned them that Eric was on Dragonstone, though to be fair it's pretty obvious that she did. I like to think however that her saying she wasn't believed at first means, like I guessed, that she had to find Eric first to convince them about his twin being on the island. I got it wrong though about why Mysaria would choose to stay and ask to be part of Rhaenyra's court. It's not because she's changed her mind about not wanting to be powerful and influential, but because she thinks Rhaenyra would make the better ruler of the Seven Kingdoms. Point number 7, I love that Mysaria, already one of my favourite characters, describes Seasmoke the same way I did in my previous video, as lonely. Seasmoke, the lonely dragon. Point number 8, while in the show Rhaenyra asks Rhaena to take her sons Joffrey, Aegon and Viserys to the Eyrie, then to leave Joffrey there and to take Aegon and Viserys to Essos, in Fire and Blood only Joffrey and Rhaena travelled to the Eyrie and stayed there for the rest of the dance, whilst Aegon and Viserys were sent to Essos but travelled via the ship the Gay abandoned. Also, this whole distribution of Rhaenyra's sons wasn't done by their mother but by their brother Jacaerys, and it didn't actually happen until later in the dance. Point number 9, Daemon, is your armour 100% arrow proof? Because if not, why don't you have a shield? What would you have done if you turned a corner and found yourself faced with a firing line of soldiers holding bows and arrows or crossbows or something? Point number 10, I wonder what Rhaenyra would have to say if she heard Daemon telling others to also call him Your Grace. Point number 11, unlike in Season 1 Episode 1 when Kristen asked Rhaenyra for her favour, this time he asks Alicent for hers. Fitting since in that same episode, Daemon asked Alicent for hers, and that's who Kristen is now riding out to face. Let's hope Alicent's favour helps Kristen more now than it did for Daemon, since he went on to lose to Kristen in the joust. Point number 12, I love that Rhaenys reminds all these men encouraging war that Rhaenyra wears the crown of her granddad, Jaehaerys the Conciliator, with a synonym for Conciliator being Peacemaker. A king who undid much of the damage done to the Seven Kingdoms by his uncle Maegor the Cruel, and united them as they never had been before by connecting them all via a massive road system. Point number 13, we see that as well as Rhaenyra's sons, Rhaena will also be taking with her 4 dragon eggs, and according to episode 3 director Geeta Vasant Patel, speaking to Belen Edwards of Mashable.com, those are Daenerys' eggs. All of us who work on this show are big Game of Thrones fans, so it was very exciting to shoot that scene. So 3 of these dragon eggs are the very same eggs that Daenerys' dragons will hatch from at the end of Season 1 of Game of Thrones, those eggs most likely being the red, green and gold eggs, which Drogon, Rhaegal and Viserion will hatch from respectively. This goes against the popular theory that in 54 AC, a woman called Alyssa Farman, who was the lover of Jaehaerys the Conciliator's sister Rhaena Targaryen, stole 3 dragon's eggs from Dragonstone when her and Rhaena's relationship broke down, fled with them to Essos and sold them to the Sea Lord of Braavos. Since it's been confirmed though that 3 of these 4 dragon eggs are Daenerys's, that explains why Rhaena in the show has been given the additional task of taking Aegon and Viserys to Essos. Most likely she'll also take the eggs with her, thus explaining how they ended up on the continent to then many years later end up being a wedding gift to Daenerys from Illyrio Mopatis. Point number 14, while I think most people will assume Helaena saying she forgives Alicent is because of Alicent banging Kristen when Blood and Cheese happened, and is giving Alicent the forgiveness that she wasn't able to get from her dad, I find it a more interesting possibility that Helaena is actually forgiving her mother for misinterpreting Viserys' final words, mistaking him saying Aegon is the prince that was promised as him referring to their son Aegon when he was actually talking about Aegon the Conqueror. Viserys mistaking Alicent for Rhaenyra and Alicent mistaking Viserys, which has now led to civil war and unnecessary death on both sides. Mistakes being made and forgiveness being given or not has been a big part of the show so far, and I think mistake would have made a better title for the episode rather than the burning mill. Point number 15, gotta love the idiocy of Aegon to not realise he is being manipulated by a guy who's claiming it's actually others who are manipulating him. first in regards with Otto and now his own mother. Point number 16, I wonder what this moment was all about, with a woman dropping a pouch of money down to a woman who passes it off sneakily to another woman, who we then follow for a short while before switching to following Ulf. Point number 17, and speaking of Ulf, without spoiling anything, just like with Alan, Adam and Hugh, I'll just say Ulf is a major character from Fire and Blood, where he is indeed a dragon seed, though which Targaryens he is related to is never revealed in the book, and just like Hugh, he lives on Dragonstone, not in King's Landing. Point number 18, if you're wondering where you recognise this woman from, it's Diana from Season 1 Episode 8, the woman Aegon raped and Alicent paid off and gave moon tea to make sure she didn't have a bastard child. Point number 19, if you think it would be highly unlikely for Baelor to be able to spot Kristen, Gwaine and the others on the ground from that height, even with their armour glinting in the sun, it seems Moondancer actually spots them first and alerts Baelor she's seen something by making a noise, and Baelor just then simply followed where Moondancer was looking. Point number 20, very interesting that Daemon, a Targaryen, experiences a vision from a weirwood tree. Was it then presumably the old gods who sent him the vision? Also neat that we got to see Millie Alcock again, even briefly. Point number 21, without spoiling anything, just like with Ulf, Alan, Adam and Hugh, I'll just say this mysterious woman at Harrenhal is a major character from Fire and Blood, and I'm not even going to mention her name until the show does. Point number 22, this whole Rhaenyra sneaking into King's Landing disguised as a scepter scenario is a major departure from the source material, as it never happens in Fire and Blood at all. But that's not to say I don't like it. After everything that's happened, it's interesting to see what Alicent and Rhaenyra have to say to each other, how Alicent looks at Rhaenyra as if she's gone mad, how Rhaenyra refuses to surrender because she knows she's the rightful heir, yet still hopes for peace in some fashion, and how Alicent discovers that she mistook what Viserys was saying about Aegon the prince that was promised, and Rhaenyra is reassured her father never did change his mind about her being his heir. Yet still, Alicent refuses to help Rhaenyra, insisting the Iron Throne, but also tells Rhaenyra to leave instead of having her captured. It's naive to think of any character in House of the Dragon as being all good or all evil, and it's doubly naive to think Rhaenyra not wanting war means she should just abandon her claim as queen. At this point, no matter the promises made by the Greens that the Blacks will not be harmed if they surrender and bend the knee, Rhaenyra will not consent to living the rest of her life with the possibility that any time Aegon could send another assassin to make sure she never tries to take the throne again. She will not consent to her entire family being imprisoned or kept under constant guard, being permanently separated from their dragons, that Jacaerys would most likely be required to join the Night's Watch and give up any potential claim to the throne, that Joffrey, Aegon and Viserys would need to be made wards, aka prisoners of the Greens to ensure Rhaenyra's continued compliance. But even then, any descendants of Rhaenyra's line would still pose a threat to Aegon's if they ever chose to rise up and claim the Iron Throne for themselves. So the safest thing to do for the Greens to ensure no future civil war could ever happen would just be to end Rhaenyra's line completely, and she most likely knows this and expects as much from Aegon, especially after what Daemon has done to his son. I mean, would Aegon believe Rhaenyra had no part in the murder of Jaehaerys and it was all just Daemon's idea? Would he be content with just having Daemon executed and leaving the rest of Rhaenyra's family alone? Possibly, but then there's still the possibility that he would enact vengeance on her entire family, considering he's perfectly willing to plunge the Seven Kingdoms into war to get it even now. And that's even assuming Daemon would even surrender in the first place, which I highly doubt. He would most likely choose to go down fighting rather than bend the knee and give up the titles and power and dragon he has as Rhaenyra's husband, the Queen's husband. So yeah, essentially at this point, both peace and surrender is impossible for both the Greens and the Blacks based on everything they've done to each other so far. To round all this off, my most disliked part of the episode goes to Daemon walking around Harrenhal with only a sword, no shield, no way to protect himself from any incoming arrows from hidden bowmen. And my most liked part of the episode goes to Rhaenys essentially acting as Rhaenyra's hand, with all of her wise counsel and putting the warmongers of the Black Council in their place. I'm surprised a certain group of morons on the internet haven't chosen to start calling her a man-hating girl boss or some other stupid thing yet. I guess it doesn't play into their narrative that House of the Dragon has to be the thing to currently support, whilst Star Wars The Acolyte has to be the thing to currently hate. Point number 1, so did anyone else think at first that it was going to be Viserys sat on the throne? Would have been neat to see Paddy Considine again, but a second appearance by Millie Alcock.
A surprise, to be sure, but a welcome one.
It does make sense so that young Rhaenyra will be the one on the throne, as it mirrors Daemon's first appearance in Season 1 when Rhaenyra walks up to him sitting on the throne. Point number 2, if you're wondering what Rhaenyra was saying to Daemon in the non-subtitled High Valyrian, according to David J. Peterson, who created the language for the show, she says, "It's been said that Targaryens are closer to gods than to men. In my eyes, you were a god, Daemon Targaryen, the prince of the city, the lord of Flea Bottom. I was an innocent. You exploited me and abandoned me. You sullied my name at court. You empowered my rivals. You tried to make my ruin. You put me on that throne, and you love me and you hate me for it. You created me, Daemon, yet you are now set on destroying me. or because your brother loved me more than he did you. Point number 3, I wonder when Black Phillip filmed his cameo for this episode. Point number 4, Oscar? But he's supposed to be Grover's great-grandson. Grover's grandson in the books is actually called Elmo. I guess they didn't want Damon chatting to a kid with such an obvious Muppet name. Point number 5, Damon talking about Oscar smothering his granddad to claim his inheritance faster has me wondering if he would have had similar thoughts about Viserys in the last days of his life if he had been named heir. Point number 6, so unless I'm completely misunderstanding this interaction between Rhaenys, Alan and Corlys, it appears that Rhaenys suspects Alan is a bastard child of Corlys's and her suspicions might be correct. In Fire and Blood, Alan and Adam's mother Marilda however claimed that the father of her 2 sons wasn't Corlys but actually Laenor, though since we know Laenor preferred the sword over the sheath, as it were, we have to take Marilda's claim that Laenor is the father with a grain of salt. While Grand Maester Muncan and Septon Eustace choose to believe Marilda, Mushroom in his testimony however says Alan and Adam's father is in fact Corlys. Rhaenys also never met Alan nor Adam, as Corlys kept their existence a secret from her since she wouldn't be too happy to hear about her husband getting it on with a commoner half her age. The show contradicts this with Rhaenys telling Corlys that Alan should be raised up and honoured despite him being a Velaryon bastard, with this change most likely being made so that she wouldn't appear hypocritical since she knew full well the true parentage of Jacaerys and Joffrey and yet still supported them. Point number 7, this dragon figure is the same scene in Season 1 Episode 2. In that episode however, it was Viserys who dropped it causing it to break and Alicent had it fixed, which you could interpret as it symbolising the House of the Dragon breaking apart but being fixed by outside forces. This time though, it's Alicent who drops the dragon causing it to break, again symbolising the breaking apart of the House of the Dragon, but this time it is being caused by the very same outside forces as before, undoing what mending they had done previously. Point number 8, in case it wasn't obvious, that's moon tea that Alicent drinks, to ensure she doesn't end up giving birth to any of Criston Cole's babies, just like Rhaenyra did at the end of Season 1 Episode 4. Though in that instance, Viserys actually sent it to her because he thought she'd banged Daemon. Point number 9.
The Queen did not name you Hand.
Like I said in my breakdown of the previous episode, she bloody well should have done in my opinion, since Rhaenys is the only voice of reason right now and it would have made it easier for her to control the warmongering council. Point number 10. Do you think during the entirety of Aemon's speech, Aegon understood 0% of it and was just trying to think of what to say back in High Valyrian? I wonder how much the other members of the council understood of what Aemon said as well. Point number 11. First we had Daenerys leaving out her Starbucks cup for all to see, and now Alicent leaves out her abortion drink for Larys to spot. So careless. Point number 12. Wait, is that Aemond? No wait, it's Daemon. As Aemond? So Daemond. In any case, this thing of Daemon seeing himself as Aemond reminds me of the Luke vs Vader in the cave on Dagobah scene from The Empire Strikes Back when Luke sees his face in Vader's helmet. Point number 13, so did Daemon actually have this conversation with Alice at some point in the night and only just now exited his fugue state sat at the table, or did the entire vision take place when he took a sip from his cup and he was acting normally before that? Point number 14, in case you didn't realise, this guy talking to Daemon, Willem Blackwood, is the kid who tried to woo Rhaenyra back in Season 1 Episode 4 and who killed the heckling Gerald Bracken. Point number 15, in the Inside the Episode video for this episode on the Game of Thrones YouTube channel, Ryan Condal says part of Daemon's story at Harrenhal is dealing with the sins of his past. That's why he keeps seeing young Rhaenyra, why he saw a dead Jaehaerys, why he sees himself as Aemond, and why he also sees his late wife Laena. I wonder if then we'll also see Daemon's first wife Rhea Royce, who he most likely bludgeoned to death with a rock back in Season 1 Episode 5. Point number 16, it's interesting to see the juxtaposition between the Black and Green councils. The Black Council just sit arguing with each other and not doing anything because they need either Rhaenyra or Daemon to lead them, but then you have the Green Council perfectly capable of getting stuff done without Aegon being involved at all. I mean, he just gets up and leaves and they just keep on talking business as if nothing even happened. Point number 17, damn Alicent, just telling Aegon like it is, keep your head down and your mouth shut and just let the more talented people handle everything. Bit hypocritical of her though, since she definitely wouldn't want to be in the same place with no voice and letting everyone else make the decisions without her input. I mean, Aemond and Cole making plans and decisions without consulting Aegon is just the same as when the small council made plans to put Aegon on the throne without consulting Alicent. Point number 18, Meleys is no stranger to battle. From what we know of the life of Meleys in the books, she had never been ridden until 75 AC during the Jaehaerys Conciliator's long reign of relative peace. There's no mention of her ever being in any kind of battle, especially not against any other dragons. What experience of fighting can Meleys have? It could be that Meleys and Rhaenys have been in battle before but it was just never recorded, or it's instead a retcon by the show of the events of the Myrish bloodbath in 92 AC. In the books, Corlys, his fleets, and Prince Aemon Targaryen, Rhaenys' father, on his dragon Caraxes, the very same Caraxes now ridden by Daemon, set out to deal with Myrish pirates that had invaded the island of Tarth. and Rhaenys had wanted to join her husband and her father but couldn't because she was pregnant with Laena and Aemon wouldn't allow her to risk herself and her child. So the show could have changed events so that Rhaenys and Meleys did participate in the marriage bloodbath, explaining how they had at least past experience of battling men, if not other dragons. Point number 19, if you're confused why Rhaenyra tells Jace that Viserys believes she was meant to be the protector, aka the prince that was promised, that's because that's what he literally thought right up until the end. His dying words to Alicent, who he had mistaken for Rhaenyra, were, to unite the realm against the cold of the dark, it is you are the one, you must do this. Since Balon, the son he had hoped for and thought might be the prince that was promised, died soon after being born, Viserys assumed he had misinterpreted the prophecy and named Rhaenyra his heir, believing she was actually going to be the one to fulfill it. And if you're going to argue that the prophecy talks about a prince and it can't be Rhaenyra because she's a girl, don't forget about the reveal from Game of Thrones Season 7 Episode 2 that the noun translated as prince is actually gender neutral in High Valyrian. Essentially the prophecy should be the person that was promised. Point number 20, you would think since Rhaenys in the show claims to have battle experience, she should have known to hit the lined up men from the side with dragonfire so as to maximize casualties and create a wall of fire trapping men on the one side from falling back and the men on the other from advancing. Plus, why didn't she hit the tree line, set the whole forest ablaze? Those trapped amongst the burning trees would die from either smoke or fire, and it would drive those closer to the tree line out into the open to make them easier targets. Point number 21, I wonder when H-Bomber Guy filmed his cameo for this episode. Point number 22, in Fire and Blood, the dance of the three dragons happened quite differently than in the show. While in the show, Aegon showing up on Sunfire was unexpected, in Fire and Blood it was all part of Kristen's plan for both Aegon and Aemon to engage any dragon of the Blacks that showed up. Show Aemon clearly had no problem catching his brother and his brother's dragon in the path of Vhagar's fire, but in the book it's more ambiguous if Aemon intended to harm his brother. At one point, Meleys had Sunfire's neck in her jaws, which incidentally was adapted to her having her neck in Vhagar's jaws for the show, when Vhagar crashed down onto both of them from above and they all plummeted to the ground. Vhagar survived unharmed, Meleys had been injured by the fall and then was presumably ripped apart by Vhagar afterwards, and Sunfire Lidba had had one wing torn from his body, kinda like the dragon statue that lost its wing when Viserys and Alicent dropped it to the ground. Aemon was unhurt, Aegon had many broken bones and was severely burnt across half of his body, and all that could be found of Rhaenys was a charred corpse, burnt black to the point it wasn't certain if it was her or not, they just had to assume. We'll have to see if Show Aegon is still alive, and if he is, I wonder what he'll have to say about Aemond breathing dragonfire at him. Maybe Aemond will get lucky and his brother will be stuck in a coma or something, so he won't have to deal with his accusations. Point number 23, I've seen a lot of Reddit posts and comments saying the Blacks didn't anticipate an ambush by a green dragon and that Rhaenys should have flown away when Vhagar showed up. First off, of course they knew a green dragon showing up was a possibility. They're not stupid. That's why Rhaenyra wanted to go herself. She knew the danger and wasn't capable of ordering anyone else to go. And Rhaenys obviously knew the danger as well, and that's why she volunteered herself as tribute to on the one hand ensure Rhaenyra, Jace and Baelor didn't have to go, and on the other hand make up for not burning all the greens when she had the chance to last season. Even in the book she knew the danger and didn't flee when Aegon and Aemon showed up. With a glad cry and a crack of her whip, she turned Meleys towards the foe. Against Vhagar alone she might have had some chance, but against Vhagar and Sunfire together, doom was certain. Which leads me into the second point of why she didn't just fly away. Why would she? The battle wasn't over yet. She went there to ensure Cole's army didn't take Rook's Rest, and to stop Cole she had to take out Vhagar. If she'd fled the moment Vhagar showed up, the soldiers of Rook's Rest might have just surrendered, turned their back on Rhaenyra, who they would die for, but whose dragon riders won't die for them, which would cause other houses to turn their backs on Rhaenyra. So yeah, the Blacks knew that Cole attacking Rook's Rest was a trap, so obvious a trap that you can't even really call it a trap, and Rhaenys went knowing full well she most likely was going to face other dragons. Maybe she thought it was just going to be Vhagar, that Aegon and Sunfire wouldn't also be there, but still it's doubtful to think she didn't at least expect Vhagar to show up. And the whole point of her going was to make sure Rook's Rest didn't fall, so obviously she wasn't just going to run away and let it fall because enemy dragons showed up. She would stay and fight. Point number 24, and so Rhaenys, the queen who never was, died in this episode released on the 7th of July, which is the same day and month she was also born, the 7th day of the 7th moon in 74 AC. It's also interesting that her death in the show is very reminiscent of Rhaenys Targaryen's death in the books, and by Rhaenys I mean Aegon the Conqueror's sister wife Rhaenys. In 10 AC, during the First Dornish War, at the castle Hellholt, a scorpion bolt hit Rhaenys' dragon Meraxes in the eye. Both Meraxes and Rhaenys fell from the sky and smashed into Hellholt, destroying half of the castle. just like how Rhaenys and Meleys fell from the sky and smashed into Rook's Rest in this episode. Point number 25, I've seen people think Aemon had his sword drawn here because he was intending to finish off Aegon if he wasn't already dead and Criston shouting stopped him. I think it's pretty clear he had his sword drawn just in case he bumped into anyone wanted to kill him, and he was already about to sheath his sword before Criston even shouted. Point number 26, poor Criston thinking, how in the seven hells am I going to explain this to the woman who lets me fuck her sometimes? To round all this off, my most disliked part of the episode goes to, I guess Rhaenys not using Meleys's fire as strategically as she could have, but really that's such a minor thing. This episode was pretty much perfect in my opinion. And my most liked part of the episode goes to, of course, the dance of the three dragons. It was the highlight of the episode, and Eve Bess as Rhaenys was absolutely amazing. Sad to see her go. Point number 1, I thought the opening credits were going to change again and replace Jaehaerys and the hanging rat catchers with something from the Dance of Three Dragons, like Vhagar breathing fire on Sunfire and Meleys, or Sunfire and Aegon after crashing to the ground, or Aemond and Vhagar killing Rhaenys and Meleys. Point number 2, you know what? I take issue with how Meleys is being pronounced in the show. Like, if you look at how Alice's name is spelled A-L-Y-S and how it is pronounced as sounding like Alice, then why is Meleys, which is spelled M-E-L-E-Y-S, pronounced in the same way? That's why I was originally pronouncing it Malaise, like the actual word Malaise spelled M-A-L-A-I-S-E, and is the pronunciation I'm going back to. I don't care what the show says. Point number 3, seeing people wonder on Reddit how those in King's Landing thought of dragons as unkillable gods. First, I didn't realise this one kid represented and spoke for the entire population of King's Landing and their beliefs. That's just wild. Second, the previous dragon that died, Arax, only had one eyewitness to their death. Literally. The previous dragon to die before Arax was Balerion the Black Dread, and he died of old age in 94 AC. And the dragon that died before Balerion was Quicksilver, ridden by Aegon Targaryen, Aegon the Uncrowned, brother of Jaehaerys the Conciliator and Good Queen Alysanne, who was killed by Balerion, ridden by Aegon's uncle Maegor the Cruel, in the battle beneath the God's Eye in 43 AC. Considering this episode takes place in 132 AC, that means it's been 89 years since it was widely known by the small folk that dragons can be killed by anything other than old age. So it's not impossible to think that the knowledge that dragons could be killed could have faded somewhat over time amongst the small folk, and that they had started to think of the dragons as gods being ridden by Targaryens, who are already considered closer to gods than men. Point number 4, I've also seen people criticise Ryan Condal for saying in the Inside the Episode video on the Game of Thrones YouTube channel for this episode that
Meleys is a beloved dragon.
With the criticism being, how can Meleys be a beloved dragon amongst the small folk after what happened in the Dragon Pit at the end of Season 1, Episode 9? And while I'm sure the relatives and friends of those that died when Meleys and Rhaenys smashed their way up from underground probably don't like Meleys anymore, why does that necessarily mean the entire population of King's Landing would stop liking Meleys? This, coupled with the criticism against the kid saying he thought the dragons were gods, really makes me think a lot of people view the small folk of King's Landing as a hive mind for some reason, that they all share these same thoughts and feelings and opinions, when that's really just not the case at all. Point number 5, Hugh saying the remains of Meleys
It's just me.
is giving me flashbacks to Game of Thrones at Season 6, Episode 1, when Ramsay Bolton describes Miranda's corpse as
"This is good meat. Feed it to the hounds."
Point number 6, so the show is following the book in keeping Aegon alive, and is keeping him, as I guessed, in a coma so he can't tell anyone that Aemond tried to do him in. Good thing Meleys' head blocked a fair amount of Vhagar's fire, and Aegon was wearing Valyrian steel, or he would have literally been toast. Point number 7, Cole saying Sunfire was long in the dying and later Rhaenyra saying he'd been slain to Jace has understandably got a lot of people thinking Sunfire is dead, which would seriously mess with the canon considering Joffrey tells Margaery in Game of Thrones Season 3 Episode 4,
Rhaenyra Targaryen was murdered by her brother, or rather his dragon. It ate her while her son watched.
If Sunfire were dead though, why would Cole say he has left people to protect Rook's Rest and Sunfire? Why would a dragon corpse need protection? and Rhaenyra has obviously heard that Aegon and Sunfire were knocked out of the sky and seems to be just assuming the dragon is dead. Fire and Blood tells us Sunfire survived the Battle of Rook's Rest, having to remain on the ground due to his injured wing, eating the burnt corpses left on the battlefield, and after they ran out, calves and sheep brought by Kristen's men. Point number 8, it seems Rhaenyra is now getting a taste of what Aegon had to deal with during his council meetings.
What would you have me do?
Nothing.
The thing is though, her council says they should hit King's Landing whilst Vhagar is tired after fighting at Rook's Rest, and since the only way to do that soon enough would be with dragons, Rhaenyra logically says that she'd have to do it. But then her council says she isn't allowed, so what? Are they expecting Jace and Baelor to attack King's Landing on their tiny dragons? Why don't they realise that the smaller the dragon, the easier it is to kill, not just by other dragons, but by arrows and bolts as well? And that includes their riders, since they are easy to spot as they can't hide behind the body of their dragons as well as those who ride larger dragons can. Or maybe they're hoping to send another message to Daemon, and this time he won't actually ignore it, which is really just a fool's hope. All Rhaenyra's council seems to do is just say this must be done, without actually explaining how it can be done or allowing it to be done at all if it in any way involves Rhaenyra flying out on Syrax. They're useless. Point number 9. So in Game of Thrones Season 1 Episode 5, the area looked like an ugly ass termite mound. In Game of Thrones Season 4 Episode 5, it had been updated to be somewhat more book accurate, and in this episode, its design has been altered again. While the designs in Game of Thrones Season 4 Episode 5 and in this episode are a million times better than its design in Game of Thrones Season 1 Episode 5, it still doesn't hold a candle to how it's described in the books and depicted in artwork by Ted Naismith in The World of Ice and Fire. Point number 10. Did Rhaenyra's reaction here to hearing about Rhaenys dying seem to anyone else that it was the first she was hearing of it? It seemed like it to me. If it was a bit of a dick move by Jane to just drop that bombshell on Rhaenyra then walk out. Point number 11. Again, the similarities between how Aegon and Rhaenyra are being treated by their councils is shown here in Rhaenyra's chat with Mysaria, but it also made me think of how the modern monarchy works in my home country of the United Kingdom. The monarch of the UK is the head of state, and while they do rule, it is actually the government in that monarch's name that, governs. And the monarch can actually do what they like. They follow the positive example of previous monarchs and are advised by their and their subjects' elected government and councillors. So when Rhaenyra says to Mysaria,
I am now the sovereign, I cannot do as I please.
It reminds me of this scene from The Crown Season 1 Episode 4.
It doesn't feel right, as head of state, to do nothing.
It is exactly right.
Is it? But surely doing nothing is no job at all.
To do nothing is the hardest job of all, and it will take every ounce of energy that you have.
Point number 12. I didn't even know the difference between hilt and foible until I looked up foible and found it means the part of a sword blade from the middle to the point, as well as the definition I knew, which is a minor weakness or eccentricity in someone's character. And now we know.
And knowing is half the battle.
Point number 13. So this is Alyssa Targaryen, sister wife of Balon the Brave and mother to Viserys and Daemon. Yeah, Daemon had a vision of getting it on with his own mother. But why didn't he stop, I hear you ask? Didn't he recognise her? Well, considering she died when he was 2 after giving birth to another son who of course was called Aegon, because she can never have enough Aegons, who died 6 months after being born, it makes sense he didn't recognise her. I think even book readers didn't recognise her, since her appearance doesn't match between book and show. In Fire and Blood, she's described as having dirty blonde hair with no silver in it at all, mismatched eye colour with one being violet and the other green, and her nose was crooked after she got whacked in the nose by a wooden sword when she was 6 years old. Point number 14. Aemond being named regent in Fire and Blood is breezed past pretty quickly, with just Cole telling him, you must rule the realm now until your brother is strong enough to take the crown again. And so one-eyed Aemond the Kinslayer took up the iron and ruby crown of Aegon the Conqueror. That's it. No Alicent saying she thinks she should be regent and having everyone except Grand Maester Orwell slap her down and say, I think it should be Aemond actually. And when Aemond gets the crown in the book, he says something quite interesting. It looks better on me than it ever did on him, which could play into the theory that even in the books, Aemond was intentionally trying to get Aegon killed during the Dance of the Three Dragons over Rook's Rest so that he could become king. Also of note though that in Fire and Blood it said Aemond never actually chose to call himself the king, just protector of the realm and Prince Regent. We'll have to wait and see in the show if, like Daemon telling people to call him king, Aemond will also want that, or if he'll just stick to being called Prince like in the book. Point number 15, great long shot of Alicent coming to terms with how she's been pushed aside by her council and then looking incredulously at them as Aemon gives his orders, especially the one about the gates of King's Landing being closed. Her worst fears have come true with having no voice on the council. What happened to Aegon has now happened to her and she does not like it. Now she knows how her son felt. Good. Point number 16, Jesus Christ, Cheddar the dog here is the most loyal dog to ever exist since Fry's dog Seymour in Futurama. Actually even more loyal since Fry never kicked Seymour. Cheddar had all the reason to abandon Cheese after he kicked him, and yet he chose to stick around. Actually, that's less loyalty and more like the bastard child of an abusive relationship and Stockholm Syndrome. Point number 17, I get the idea is that Alice disappeared as she went behind Simon, but I find it funny to think she's still just standing there, hiding behind him. Point number 18, in Fire and Blood, it's actually Jace who asks Corlys to become the Hand of the Queen, since by this point Rhaenyra wasn't doing so hot mentally, as she was still dealing with her stillbirth, the death of Lucerys, the death of Rhaenys, and Corlys blaming her for his wife's death. Point number 19, I like how they just randomly inserted a short scene of Sir Alfred and his men riding through a forest to bridge the gap between Alinda being at one of King's Landing's gates and then her actually walking about in King's Landing. Point number 20, another appearance by Diana.
A surprise, to be sure, but a welcome one.
I keep thinking the reappearance of some characters from season 1 are just going to be one and done cameos, but then the show says nuh-uh and has them appear multiple times. Point number 21, even after all the ways Alicent has treated him harshly throughout his life, Aegon still wants his mother. That's sweet. I've seen people say him saying mummy felt out of place because it sounds more modern than say mother or mama, but I think it's the perfect way to show his childlike vulnerability at this moment. Point number 22, I think Jace saying he hopes his mother won't follow Visenya's example is another instance of him not wanting her to risk herself by jumping on her dragon and flying into battle, because that's what Visenya did a lot during Aegon the Conqueror's conquest of Westeros. She even got hit in the shoulder by an arrow one time. Plus, Jace might be thinking of how Visenya's son, Maegor the Cruel, ended up dead on the Iron Throne with one of its sword spikes through his neck and his wrist cut. Yeah, I doubt that's how Jace ultimately wants to go. Point number 23, in Fire and Blood, Rhaenyra's dwarf court jester Mushroom claims he was the one who came up with the idea that dragon seeds, those with any Targaryen blood in their veins, should be called upon to try and claim the currently riderless dragons on Dragonstone, and that he then gave the idea to Jace. Though you have to take what Mushroom claims with a big pinch of salt, since usually when it comes to Mushroom,
he's got word stuff from his ass to his mouth.
To round all this off, my most disliked part of the episode goes to being forced to watch a man eat out his own mother. Thanks so much writer Ty Mickle and director Claire Kilner. And my most liked part of the episode goes to the long shot of Alicent at the small council table after Aemond was named regent instead of her. Point number 1, so the opening credits have changed quite a bit from last episode. After the depiction of the Great Council at Harrenhal, instead of showing Alicent's entrance at Rhaenyra and Laenor's wedding party in her green dress and showing the greens and blacks sat at the table, it cuts straight to showing Aegon on the Iron Throne and Rhaenyra on the Dragonstone throne, the return to the depiction of Vhagar killing Lucerys and Arrax, last seen in the opening of Season 2, Episode 2. Then we see Jaehaerys being decapitated and the hanging of the rat catchers, and finally a new addition, the aftermath of the Battle of Rook's Rest and the Dance of the Three Dragons from 2 episodes ago. As well as the dead men, we see, I assume to be Aemond standing between Sunfire and Molaise, who are lying on the ground with Vhagar flying overhead. And if you look closely, you'll see there's no blood coming from Sunfire, but there is blood coming from Molaise, and it's that black blood mixed with the red blood of the men that seeps towards the Iron Throne, which tells us that Sunfire is most likely not dead, just beaten the hell up like her rider, and the mixing of the black and red blood symbolises that both men and dragon's blood will both have to be spilled to win the Iron Throne. Point number 2, hearing the reigns of Castamere being played 129 years before the events of the Rain-Tarbeck Revolt in 261 AC that inspired its creation, makes me think of the character of Simon in the 2000 version of Jesus Christ Superstar having a tattoo of a cross on his arm before Christ has even been crucified. Point number 3, if you're curious where the Golden Tooth is in relation to other locations, we can see on this map from atlasofIceandfireblog.wordpress.com that the Golden Tooth is about halfway along the River Road, as it is called, between Casterly Rock and River Run. Point number 4, just a nitpick, but it seems a bit of Aemon's dialogue here was ADR'd.
Are the Lannisters so diminished that they cannot march from the Tooth to Harrenhal?
His jaw movements don't match what he's saying, and his voice doesn't sound like it was recorded in the small council chamber. Sounds too clean to me. Point number 5, in Fire and Blood, it wasn't Aemon who came up with the idea to make an alliance with the Triarchy, but Otto's when he was still Aegon's hand. In fact, waiting for the Triarchy to decide whether to accept the terms set by Otto, exclusive trading rights at King's Landing in return for clearing the Sea Snake's blockade of the Gullet, was part of the reason why an impatient Aegon removed Otto as hand. Point number 6, there's no mention of ever being suggested that Alicent might marry the Red Kraken to ensure his loyalty to the Greens, the Red Kraken being Dalton Greyjoy, who at the time of the Dance of the Dragons in the books was 16. Point number 7, and there we have the final nail in the coffin for Alicent wanting her voice to be heard and to have a say in what's happening. Though in the Inside the Episode video for this episode on the Game of Thrones YouTube channel, Ryan Condal reveals that Aemond didn't dismiss his mother from the small council out of cruelty, but because she doesn't actually have a role on it. She's just a holdover from when she stepped in after Viserys died. So he still cares about his mum, he just doesn't want her on the small council telling everyone what she thinks, probably because a fair amount of what she thinks goes against what Aemond wants to do, so, it makes sense why he wouldn't want her on the small council. Point number 8, Paddy Considine's back.
A surprise, to be sure, but a welcome one.
A double surprise actually, since when we got a second appearance by young Rhaenyra when I thought we were going to see Viserys again, and that we've also seen Daemon's late wife Laena and his late mother Alyssa, I thought the only ghosts of Daemon's past we were going to see were only going to be the women. But then here comes Viserys saying a bunch of what he said to Daemon back in Season 1, Episode 1. Still holding out hope we get another appearance of Daemon's first wife Rhea Royce though. Point number 9, I love how so much interaction between Daemon and Alice has been introduced into the show when Fire and Blood tells us, whatever her powers, it would seem Daemon Targaryen was immune to them, for little is heard of this supposed sorceress whilst the prince held Harrenhal. Also, I have some thoughts on how close to and trusting of Daemon is with Alice, but I'll get into that more towards the end of the video as it's connected to another point. Point number 10, book accurate the way Stefan goes out here, burnt alive when trying to claim sea smoke. Hardcore the Dragon Keeper slicing his own throat whilst on fire reminds me of this tank guy blowing his brains out whilst on fire from the movie Fury. Point number 11, in Fire and Blood, Aemond never decides to replace Criston as hand with Otto, nor does he order Larys to send for Otto. Point number 12, Aemond giving Aegon his small council ball token thing could be read in different ways according to Aemond actor Ewan Mitchell in this Variety article. It's the king's marker. Maybe Aemond is giving it back to his brother. Maybe he's trying to reassure him that everything's going to be okay. You'll be king after you recover. Maybe lure him into that false sense of security. I like to think it symbolises Aemond taking Aegon off the board. He's removed his mother from the small council and now Aegon by getting rid of his token. And I wouldn't be surprised if Aemond brought his own unique token to the next small council meeting. Point number 13, if you're curious who this dragon is, it's Stormcloud and he belongs to Aegon the Younger. Point number 14, in the books there was never any mention of there being any wild dragons in the Vale. George R.R. Martin actually has something to say about this show change on his blog on georgerrmartin.com. My dragons are creatures of the sky. They fly and can cross mountains and plains, cover hundreds of miles, but they don't unless their riders take them there. They are not nomadic. During the heyday of Valyria, there were 40 dragon-riding families with hundreds of dragons amongst them, but aside from our Targaryens, all of them stayed close to the freehold and the lands of the long summer. From time to time, a dragon rider might visit Volantis or another Valyrian colony, even settle there for a few years, but never permanently. Think about it. If dragons were nomadic, they would have overrun half of Essos and the Doom would only have killed a few of them. Similarly, the dragons of Westeros seldom wander far from Dragonstone. Elsewise, after 300 years, we would have had dragons all over the realm and every noble house would have a few. The 3 wild dragons mentioned in Fire and Blood have lairs on Dragonstone. The rest can be found in the Dragon Pit of King's Landing or in deep caverns under the Dragonmont. Luke flies Arrax to Storm's End and Jace to Winterfell, yes, but the dragons would not have flown there on their own, save under very special circumstances. You won't find dragons hunting the Riverlands or the Reach or the Vale or roaming the Northlands or the Mountains of Dawn. Point number 15, Grand Maester Orwell, whilst chatting to Alicent, calls back to Kristen murdering Lyman Beesbury in Season 1 Episode 9, which has caused House Beesbury to side with the Blacks and fight against House Hightower. Point number 16, there's been speculation on Helena pointing out one of her crickets has stopped singing, due to any weird thing happening with Helena, could be foreshadowing of something to come. From what I've seen, people have latched onto there being 3 cages of crickets, so the cages could either represent Alicent's 3 sons, Aegon, Aemond and Daeron, or the 3 riderless dragons on Dragonstone, Seasmoke, Silverwing and Vermithor. As Gwaine tells Alicent that Daeron is just as adept with his lute as well as his sword, the silent cricket could represent Daeron putting down his lute and taking up his sword. He has stopped singing, i.e. making music. Or it could represent Seasmoke, who was making a bunch of noise whilst flying about as Mysaria watched in Season 2 Episode 3, but by the end of this episode, he has gone silent, stopped singing because he's found himself a new rider. What do you think, if anything, Helena's cricket no longer singing could mean? Let me know in the comments below. Point number 17, at first I thought we were getting yet another goddamn appearance from Cheese's dog Cheddar, but turns out it's not the same dog. Cheddar's probably off hanging out wherever Cheese's decayed corpse has been dumped. Point number 18, without spoiling anything, this guy who gets his arm cut off could actually be the first appearance of a major character from Fire and Blood, who I'll just say is known as the Shepherd. Point number 19, this mob scene is very reminiscent of the mob scene from the book A Clash of Kings. The mob are both motivated by hunger, a member of the royal family is hit in the face by something, an arm gets chopped off, and a member of the Kingsguard is killed by the mob. Point number 20, we see after escaping the mob, Alicent has suffered a cut on her left arm, which reminds me of when she cut Rhaenyra's left arm with the Valyrian steel dagger in Season 1 Episode 7. Make of that similarity what you will. Point number 21, with what Larry says to Aegon about how his foot looked when he was born. Was it Alice that Larys' father Lionel accused of causing it via sorcery and spells? And if it was, that begs the question, just how long has Alice been living in Harrenhal and how old is she actually? Could we have another Melisandre situation on our hands again? Point number 22, I can't believe they got CM Brooke back as Emma just for this scene where she plays a corpse. I'm wagering she'll reappear not as a corpse but instead alive in either of the last 2 episodes of this season in another Daemon vision. Point number 23, it's hard to feel sympathy for Viserys here when he was the one who ordered his wife to be sacrificed in an attempt to save their baby. He never gave her the chance to make the choice for herself. He made it for her, and it cost him both his wife and his son. Point number 24, in Fire and Blood, Alice never journeyed to Riverrun and didn't play any part in the death of Lord Grover Tully. In the book, Grover Tully supported the Greens, but his grandson, Elmo Tully, kept Riverrun neutral for a while. And when Elmo eventually declared for the Blacks instead, Mushroom in his testimony claims Grover died of apoplexy at his grandson's actions. Point number 25, in Fire and Blood, Seasmoke never sought out another human to become his new rider. Corlys actually brought both Alan and Adam to the Sowing of the Seas, as Grandmaster Muncan calls it, though others preferred the Red Sowing, where Adam claimed Seasmoke. And Seasmoke taking a new rider in the show would suggest that Laenor Velaryon has in fact died off screen, as dragons can only have one rider at a time. Anyone else wanting to ride the dragon would have to do so as a passenger along with the dragon's rider. Point number 26, in Season 1 Episode 2, Mysaria tells Daemon,
I ensured long ago that I would never be threatened by childbirth.
Yet here it seems she tells Rhaenyra that it was some form of abortion that's caused her to no longer be able to bear children. So which is it? Was she lying to Daemon, and for what purpose? Or is she lying to Rhaenyra, and for what purpose? Also, with her mentioning scars and giving 2 different stories, is she trying to be Christopher Nolan's Joker or something?
You wanna know how I got these scars?
Point number 27, in Fire and Blood a little later in the dance, it's revealed that Daemon has resumed sleeping with Mysaria with Rhaenyra's consent. Could Rhaenyra and Mysaria kissing here indicate that they are instead adapting Daemon sleeping with Mysaria whilst married to Rhaenyra as Rhaenyra sleeping with Mysaria whilst married to Daemon instead? I've also seen people criticising this kiss as being forced and woke as well by the loud minority of morons who believe in the silly superstition that is wokeness. But you have to consider how impulsive and reckless young Rhaenyra was characterised in Season 1 before she made more of an attempt to control herself as she grew older, coupled with Rhaenyra and Mysaria growing closer and closer together after the death of Rhaenys. So this is her impulsiveness and recklessness re-emerging and the closeness that has been growing between Rhaenyra and Mysaria boiling over into intimacy. I mean, out of all of Rhaenyra's advisors, Mysaria has been the one supporting Rhaenyra the most, agreeing with her plans, complimenting her, reassuring her, and if you didn't already get the feeling Rhaenyra might enjoy being physically intimate with another woman from how she interacted with Alicent when they were friends in Season 1, in Fire and Blood it said Rhaenyra became fond and more than fond of her good sister Lady Laena. Mushroom even claims that when Rhaenyra was married to Laenor they would share a bed with Khal Corrie, as it aroused the princess to watch the men disporting with one another, he tells us, and from time to time the two would include her in their pleasures. As always, we have to take what Mushroom says with a ladle of salt, but if what he says is true, in my own personal experience when it comes to women who enjoy watching two men pleasuring each other in bed, it isn't a stretch to assume that same woman also wouldn't mind engaging in same-sex bedroom fun herself. So no, I wouldn't consider this kiss between Rhaenyra and Mysaria forced, nor would I deem it woke since that's not a thing, no matter how much idiots want it to be. Calling back to point number 9, I think is actually the relationship that's developed between Daemon and Alice that you could argue has been forced. Like, why out of everyone in Harrenhal is it this strange woman who says weird things that Daemon trusts and goes to for advice and help? What sense does that make? To round all this off, my most disliked part of the episode goes to the dog Hugh says hello to not being Cheddar. And my most liked part of the episode goes to the hilarious reveal that Alicent's son Daeron has turned out alright because he's been nowhere near King's Landing and his mother. Point number 1.
And if the gods call me to greater things, who am I to refuse them?
Adam got lucky passing that speech check, saying the exact thing that resonates with Rhaenyra considering the whole A Song of Ice and Fire prophecy and how she believes it connects to her. Point number 2, in my breakdown of the previous episode, I mentioned how Alicent received a cut on the same arm as Rhaenyra did in Season 1, Episode 7. It could have just been a coincidence with no intentional meaning, but in the Inside the Episode video for this episode on the Game of Thrones YouTube channel, Alicent's actress Olivia Cook also pointed out the parallel. Point number 3, when Grand Maester Orwell says the scar on Alicent's arm will be easily hidden, I like to think Alicent also took him to be referring to how she's feeling. That the emotional scar she suffered from being removed from the small council and having her voice silenced can also be easily hidden, which leads her later on in the episode to stay out in the Kingswood for an extended period of time. She's hidden herself away. Point number 4, smart of Aemon to use what happened during the riot to remove Aegon's friends from the Kingsguard. Now he can appoint people more loyal to himself. Point number 5, I think you can read their conversation between Larys and Jasper in two ways. The first is that Jasper wanted Larys to tell Aemon about the rumour because he knew how little proof there was to back it up. Larys though got Jasper to admit how far-fetched the rumour sounded, and they both decided not to inform Aemon, so as to not appear foolish if the rumour turned out to be false. The second is that despite how Jasper says that whispers are the master of Whisperer's domain, so Larys reporting even the most outlandish of rumours wouldn't be unusual, it's his job after all, but since he sided with Aegon over Aemond, he instead convinces Jasper to remain silent and then chooses not to inform Aemond himself. Also, side note, Jasper heard the rumour from his squire, who heard it from a stable hand, who heard it from his fisherman father, who heard it from his shipmate. What is this, Spaceballs?
I am your father's brother's nephew's cousin's former roommate.
Point number 6, in Fire and Blood, it's actually Rhaenyra's dwarf court jester Mushroom who claims he said for the Blacks to look for more dragon riders
under the sheets and in the wood piles.
And also, it wasn't Rhaenyra he supposedly said it to, but Jace, and it was the prince who was the one who called for anyone, highborn and lowborn, who believed they had the blood of the dragon to try and claim any of the riderless dragons. Point number 7, I find it funny Mysaria says there might even be some Targaryen bastards on Dragonstone when in Fire and Blood it said that's where Ulf and Hugh actually live, not in King's Landing. Point number 8, just another nitpick. Like Aemond in the previous episode, it seems like a bunch of Oscar Tully's dialogue here was ADR'd.
We recognize the authority of the named heir, Queen Rhaenyra.
Looking at the movements of his jaw when he's facing away from the camera, it doesn't seem to match up with what he's saying. Point number 9, and the most badass person of the episode award goes to Oscar Tully, asserting his authority over the other Rivermen by openly showing his dislike for Daemon and taking every opportunity to subtly insult him, then forcing him to agree and humble himself before everyone because Oscar knows how badly Daemon needs the Rivermen, and the only way they are going to accept Daemon and Oscar's rule over them is if Oscar appears superior to Daemon, not so much in terms of rank, but in respect. Daemon has to show he respects Oscar and the Rivermen to gain their support. Point number 10, on GeorgeRRMartin.com, George released a blog post on May 24th, 2024, criticizing screenwriters and producers for taking great stories and altering them, making them their own, believing they are improving them. But George says they never make it better though. 999 times out of 1,000, they make it worse. Many have chosen to believe that in saying this, George is actually referring to Daemon killing Willem Blackwood. As from what I've seen said in several Reddit posts, George's favourite house is House Blackwood, and as such has written them to always be the best and on the right side of history. So the show making a Blackwood in essence a villain and having him be executed, many think this might have annoyed George enough to write this blog post. What do you guys think? Let me know in the comments below. Point number 11, a second Black Phillip cameo?
A surprise, to be sure, but a welcome one.
Point number 12, Viserys appearing in his close to death state from Season 1, Episode 8 was Paddy Considine's idea, according to Ryan Condal in the Inside the Episode video for this episode.
I had a long conversation with Paddy, and he said, I'll play the part, but I want to play the final scene when he offers the crown up. I want to do it in the decrepit makeup.
And it makes sense. This is Viserys at his weakest, and he's offering the crown to Daemon if he still wants it. And if Daemon does, it would be incredibly easy for him to take it from his brother whilst he's in this state. This is the most opportune moment for Daemon to claim the crown for his own, take it from his incredibly weak brother with no witnesses. It brings to mind when Alicent metaphorically seized the crown not for herself but for her son last season, when Viserys was at his weakest, both physically and mentally, and with no witnesses. We know what decision Alicent chose, but alas we don't see what Daemon decides to do here, as he doesn't appear for the rest of the episode. Point number 13, I think the reason why Larys is pushing Aegon so hard to get up and walking, even getting Orwell to help him in this, is because he wants Aegon to replicate the moment of Viserys arriving unexpectedly in the throne room from Season 1 Episode 8. He wants Aegon to walk through the throne room under his own power and take his place on the throne once again, inspiring and impressing all the witnesses just as his father did. Maybe Larys might even go so far as to tell Aegon to let his crown fall off his head, just to see if Aemond will put it back on as Daemon did when Viserys' crown fell off. Point number 14.
Driftmark must pass to salt and sea.
I am of salt and sea.
Subtlety. Point number 15, Jesus Christ, the whole Rhaenyra, you need to do something, you can't do any of your ideas, and I have none of my own, but you need to do something, just doesn't end. Point number 16, since in Fire and Blood it was Jace's idea to call for dragon seeds to try and claim the riderless dragons on Dragonstone, or Mushroom's idea that he gave to Jace if you choose to believe what Mushroom says, Book Jace then didn't share these same concerns as Show Jace with bastards claiming dragons and how that might affect his claim to the Iron Throne when his mother eventually dies. Point number 17, anyone else find it kind of odd how quickly Clay here deduced Rhaenyra was calling for dragon seeds because she wanted new riders for her riderless dragons? Like, what if it turned out Rhaenyra was only calling for dragon seeds so she could pull a Joffrey when he commanded all of his dad's bastards to be murdered, or because she literally did want to create an army of bastards that would support her, demonstrating that she values even the lowliest of those with Targaryen blood and that they would rather have her on the throne than Aegon. Point number 18, so if Hughes' cousins are Viserys and Daemon, that would mean he is the nephew of Baelon Targaryen, also known as the Spring Prince and Baelon the Brave, who was one of Jaehaerys the Conciliator's sons and supposedly the father of Ulf if what he says is true about his parentage. Jaehaerys and good Queen Alysanne had 13 children, and of those 13, one matches very closely with the description Hugh gives of his mother, Sarah Targaryen. Sarah was incredibly rebellious. She enjoyed playing pranks and stealing from the kitchens, which graduated to her stealing alcohol and getting drunk by the age of 12. She was also very promiscuous. She had practiced kissing naked with her two female friends, Lady Perrianne Moore and Lady Alice Turnberry, and she had 3 male favourites: Jonah Mooton, the heir to Maidenpool, Roy Connington, the Lord of Griffin's Roost, and Sir Braxton Beesbury, the heir to Honeyholt, all of whom assumed they were the first to take Sarah's virginity. After her father Jaehaerys learned of this, he first had her confined in her room, but when she tried to escape by stealing a dragon from the dragon pit, he then sent her to Oldtown to join the Faith of the Seven, perhaps permanently, perhaps temporarily, who knows. However, after enduring the life of a silent sister for a year and a half, she fled Oldtown and made her way first to Lys, making a living in a pleasure house by acting as a scepter, before moving to Volantis and becoming the owner of her own pleasure house. She was 34 when the Great Council of 101 AC took place, and 3 of her bastards went to Harrenhal to try and press their claims for the Iron Throne. Sarah herself chose not to attend and stayed in Volantis. So, while the life of Sarah Targaryen does seem to match up with Hugh's description of his mother, some people aren't convinced, like in this Reddit post I found. The major point in the Reddit post against Sarah being Hugh's mother is that whilst Hugh says rich men paid more to do the nasty with women with silver hair, in Lys, silver hair is pretty common amongst both the high folk and small folk, so it shouldn't really be that expensive to find a woman with silver hair to get down and dirty with. Ah, but what about Volantis, I hear you ask? Well, I've got no real idea how common silver hair might be in Volantis, so it might be possible that rich men in Volantis would have had to pay a lot of money to sleep with Sarah while she was running her own pleasure house. I don't know. So maybe it was Volantis that Hugh was born and grew up in for a while before leaving because he was ashamed of his mother. Or maybe, as the Reddit post theorizes, Hugh wasn't born in Volantis nor Lys, but in fact in King's Landing, or maybe on Dragonstone, since that's where Buck Hugh lived. And his mother wasn't Sarah, but instead a potential bastard daughter of Jaehaerys that he had in either of the 2 times he and his wife Alysanne became estranged. What do you guys think? Was Hugh's mother Sarah Targaryen, or just a random bastard daughter of Jaehaerys's? Let me know in the comments below. Point number 19. Oh, Hugh's daughter is dead? That just happened off screen? We didn't get to see Hugh and Kat's reaction to her death? Okay then. Point number 20, I can only imagine the disappointment from Kumas, who thought we were going to get naked Alicent when it showed her starting to undo her dress. Point number 21, man, I love The Haunting of Bly Manor, awesome show. Point number 22, I wonder if the Dragon Keepers are just going to head back to King's Landing to look after the dragons there, and if Rhaenyra would even let them leave if she knew that's what they were planning to do. Point number 23, the first person to step forward to try and claim a dragon is called Silver Dennis, and he is in fact a book character. In Fire and Blood, Silver Dennis claims he's descended from one of Maegor the Cruel's bastard sons, and it was a different dragon he tried to claim, not Vermithor, getting his arm ripped off in the attempt and then getting eaten alive along with his sons by a different dragon that showed up. Point number 24, I don't know about you, but I think Rhaenyra could have set this whole seeing if a dragon will accept a new rider thing up a bit better, by like not having them all out on the platform at the same time, instead sending them out one by one so as to, you know, cut down on collateral damage if the dragon gets mad. Like, what if it turned out one of the other dragon seeds Vermithor killed might have ended up being chosen by a different dragon, and now we'll never know because they're fucking dead. Point number 25, now's as good a time as any to go into how Rhaenyra appears to be developing somewhat of a god complex. She's already been feeling like she has a divine purpose by attributing the A Song of Ice and Fire prophecy to herself, but in this episode especially, she's really started to take to the idea that she's been chosen by the gods, to the point that she's feeling like a god herself. In this episode, she sees Seasmoke and Adam bonding as a miracle, somehow ordained as she describes it to Mysaria. Then she tells Jace that she can't gainsay, deny, which the gods have laid before her. Rhaenyra actor Emma Darcy says as much in an interview with GQ magazine that Rhaenyra is falling back on and going whole hog into religious fanaticism around the prophecy and how people view Targaryens and dragons as being gods. What is going through Rhaenyra's mind as she watches the Targaryen bastards be devoured and torched alive? I think she feels like a god. I think she feels super proud. I mean, I think it's uncomfortable. I think there's something actually also that ties into the religiosity. Even being back in proximity to dragons, to that fire, is to somehow be living her birthright. to be soaking up the divine somehow? And do you think that she feels as though the decision to essentially stage a massacre, as you say, is vindicated when the 2 new bastard dragon riders are found? Totally, without a shadow of a doubt. I mean, it's horrendous, but I think she is now this sort of emboldened fanatic, and I think she's experiencing events within a far bigger timeline. She's imagining the history books, and you know what's happening right in front of her is awful, but in 300 to 400 years, what will be documented is possibly a very short war, a huge civil war that was averted, that this was the first ruling queen, that this ruling Targaryen queen expanded the Targaryens' ability to have dragons within their armory. Point number 26, if you believe Hugh is the bastard son of Sarah Targaryen, it's ironic he has claimed Jaehaerys' dragon Thermophor, since Jaehaerys disowned Sarah, his own daughter, having declared her to have always been a whore, forbidden his wife Alysanne from contacting or visiting her, and denied his wife's request to bring their daughter home after 3 of their other daughters had died within the span of 5 years. To round all this off, my most disliked part of the episode goes to how we didn't get to see Hugh and Kat's reaction to their daughter dying. Their daughter being unwell was built up in multiple episodes, so for her death, a major point in that plotline to just happen off screen, is just weird and bad storytelling. And my most liked part of the episode goes to the whole scene of Oscar Tully talking to the Rivermen, asserting his new position of power over them by daring to insult Daemon subtly and not so subtly. Point number 1, and the opening has changed once again. We no longer see Maegor the Cruel dead on the Iron Throne, and after seeing Jaehaerys being decapitated, we don't see the hanging rat catchers. Instead, we get a more zoomed out perspective of the Battle of Rook's Rest with Aemond between Sunfire and Molaise. Note that there's still only black blood coming from Molaise, the red blood near Sunfire is from something else. We then see a dragon who is most likely Vhagar with Syrax, Vermax, Seasmoke, Vermithor, Silverwing and Moondancer, but no Caraxes. Instead, there's also a 7th mysterious dragon flying on the side of the blacks. I'll talk more about that mysterious dragon later on in the video. Point number 2, it's neat to see book-accurate Tyroshi with their dyed hair and beards, since this was left out of Game of Thrones. Point number 3, in Fire and Blood, the Triarchy didn't have to demand the Stepstones be given to them because Otto, whose idea it was to make a deal with the Triarchy in the book, actually offered it to them along with exclusive trading rights at King's Landing. Point number 4, if a bunch of these other people in the room aren't also Magisters, it would seem for the show the High Council of the Triarchy has gone from having 33 members like in Fire and Blood, 11 men each from Tyrosh, Lys and Myr, to just 3. Point number 5, Sharako Lohar is played by Abigail Thorne, trans woman and best known for her YouTube channel Philosophy Tube. If you're confused what gender Lohar is meant to be, since the other Triarchy members refer to them using he, him pronouns, Ryan Condal explains in the official podcast video for this episode on the Game of Thrones YouTube channel that Lohar is in fact a woman, but is presenting herself as masculine.
There are a couple characters who refer to Lohar as he. You obviously just now have been using she, her pronouns.
Yes.
Tell us about pronouns in this situation.
Really, the idea is it comes down to this is a woman in a man's role as a fleet commander, and this is a highly patriarchal society, and she has kind of played the David Bowie role her whole life as sort of, it's a bit of androgyny and sort of, tends one way or the other. And I think what we were really trying to say is in this time, all these salty sea dogs that she's surrounded with, all these men, their brains cannot process the idea that they're saluting a woman who is leading this massive, you see that fleet of ships at the end.
That tracks.
So she presents herself as a masculine character in the classic sense, and then they sort of just accept it, and that's why they all follow her. But we coming in from the outside with a modern eye obviously see what's going on, but it's part of playing with the difference between our sort of the modern lens that we are all watching the show through and the very backwards lens which most of the characters in the show look at life through.
Point number 6.
I am the master of ships at King's Landing.
No you ain't, Thailand. You're the master of coin, remember?
Should the master of coin be your royal steed?
Maybe Thailand is fibbing because the Triarchy is already demanding a whole lot of money from him for being a Lannister. They might ask for even more if they knew he was also the master of coin. Plus, since he's trying to procure ships, he probably reckons saying he's the master of ships will help him do that. Point number 7. Oh, so I guess Larys wanted Aegon to get up and walking just so they can run away and hide, rather than have him recreate near-death Viserys walking on his own through the throne room like I thought. Point number 8. Wait, is Sunfire actually dead? But what about what Joffrey tells Margaery in Game of Thrones Season 3 Episode 4?
Rhaenyra Targaryen was murdered by her brother, or rather his dragon. It ate her while her son watched.
And what's said in Fire and Blood. Could Sunfire actually still be alive, yet Aegon somehow just doesn't know? I mean, if he was dead, why isn't there black blood spreading from him in the opening credits like there is for Malaise? Or could the fate of Rhaenyra being eaten by Sunfire be a case of historical revisionism or an intentional lie? Since Joffrey doesn't actually name which of Rhaenyra's brothers it was and doesn't name the dragon that ate her, could the writers for this show actually have it so Rhaenyra is eaten by one of her other brother's dragons, Aemon's Vhagar or Daeron's Tessarion? Point number 9. Aegon deprecatingly recalling himself the Realms of Light is actually what Rhaenyra was referred to by court singers when she was younger. Point number 10. Rhaenyra's doing a very good impression of Daenerys from the end of A Dance with Dragons, Book 5 of A Song of Ice and Fire. Thankfully, Rhaenyra doesn't recreate what happened to Dany after she drank from a stream she found. Point number 11. Is it just me, or did Ulf being rude as hell come out of nowhere? I don't remember him being like this back in King's Landing. I guess claiming a dragon has changed him quite a bit personality-wise. Point number 12. In Fire and Blood, Corlys doesn't rename his ship to honour his late wife Rhaenys. It remains the Sea Snake. The name Corlys chose to become his nickname. Point number 13. If you're confused why earlier Larry said Rhaenyra has 7 dragons but Corlys here says she has 6, Corlys seems to be leaving out Caraxes since they don't know if Daemon is still loyal to Rhaenyra or not yet. Point number 14. If you didn't have subtitles on, you might not have been able to make out that a whispering voice calls Alfred a traitor for him choosing Daemon over Rhaenyra. Point number 15. Was anyone else expecting Alicent to also say she was happier before she was queen as well? Point number 16.
Desire for women has brought me grief after grief.
Kristen giving off some major incel energy right here. Point number 17. This figure with antlers that Daemon is most likely one of the Green Men, an order that has protected the trees on the Isle of Faces in the middle of the God's Eye since the end of the war between the First Men and the Children of the Forest 10,000 years ago. Point number 18. I'm sorry, but hearing Alice say fate, all I can think of is...
if you had the chance to change your fate, would you?
Point number 19. This person Daemon sees with a tree growing around them is Brynden Rivers, also known as Bloodraven, but those who have seen Game of Thrones will know as the Three-Eyed Raven. Brynden won't be born for another 43 years in 175 AC to Aegon Targaryen IV and his 6th mistress, Melissa Blackwood. When Aegon IV legitimized all his bastards on his deathbed, Brynden sided with the true-born Daeron Targaryen II against his fellow bastard brother Daemon Blackfyre during the first Blackfyre Rebellion. Brynden would again side with the true-born Targaryens in the subsequent 2nd and 3rd Blackfyre Rebellions, the 2nd led by Daemon's 3rd son Daemon the Younger, and the 3rd led by Daemon's 4th son, Haegon Blackfyre. During the first Blackfyre Rebellion, Daemon was supported by another of Aegon IV's legitimized bastards, Aegor Rivers, also known as Bittersteel, and a duel between Brynden and Aegor left Brynden blinded in one eye and Aegor escaping. Aegor went on to found the Golden Company in Essos, didn't support Daemon the Younger's claim to the throne in the 2nd Rebellion, but did support Haegon's claim in the 3rd. After the 3rd Blackfyre Rebellion and the death of Maekar Targaryen I, Brynden, who was Maekar's Hand of the King, hosted the Great Council of 233 AC, which, just like the Great Council of 101 AC, was meant to settle the matter of who should now sit the Iron Throne, though this Great Council was held in King's Landing, not Harrenhal. Daemon's 5th son, Aenys Blackfyre, wanted to participate in the Great Council, and while Brynden said he could, when Aenys arrived in King's Landing, Brynden had him arrested and beheaded. The newly chosen King Aegon Targaryen V, also known as Egg when he was younger, and who was also the brother of Maester Aemon of the Night's Watch, who refused the crown when it was offered to him, had Brynden sent to the wall for the murder of Aenys. Then in 239 AC, Brynden became Lord Commander of the Night's Watch, but in 252 AC disappeared whilst ranging north of the wall. Brynden was thought to be dead, but was discovered still alive north of the wall by Brandon Stark in Game of Thrones Season 4 Episode 10, and in A Dance with Dragons Book 5 of A Song of Ice and Fire, having become the three-eyed raven / crow, the last green seer, his body and the tree that has grown around him now one. Also, you'll notice that despite Brynden being described as having only one eye and a wine-stained birthmark shaped like a raven on his face in the books, in Game of Thrones he had neither, and in this episode he only has the birthmark. Point number 20, alright, if this is meant to be the Night King, Jesus Christ, what have they done to him? I'm more inclined to think it's just a random White Walker, since in the Inside the Episode video for this episode on the Game of Thrones YouTube channel, Matt Smith just refers to what Daemon sees as a White Walker.
He sees a White Walker, which is cool.
But then the wrench in that is that the video then also shows us a clip of the Night King from Game of Thrones when Matt Smith is talking about the White Walker, so I don't know. Point number 21, I can't tell which dragon this is meant to be, if indeed it is meant to actually be any of the dragons we've seen so far. It appears there are other dead dragons in the background as well, so rather than this being a depiction of an upcoming battle involving multiple dragon deaths, I think it might just be representing the deaths of dragons in general. Just like how Daemon falling underwater and seemingly drowning is also just a general representation of his eventual death, and that's all I'm going to say on that. Point number 22, we next see the red comet that appeared in Game of Thrones Season 2, Dany's 3 eggs, and then the Targaryen herself in her birthday suit along with her 3 baby dragons, Drogon, Rhaegal and Viserion, from the finale of Game of Thrones Season 1. Though, of course, Daemon doesn't know who this is. For all we know, he could be thinking it's Rhaenyra, hatching new dragons to take on the White Walkers. And there's a weird dude in a tree for some reason as well. Point number 23, was Helaena appearing to Daemon and talking to him just a part of his vision, or did she actually enter his mind all the way from King's Landing to speak to him? It seems like the case to me, since she is wearing the same clothes and her facial movements when we cut back to her in King's Landing suggest she has just finished saying something. Point number 24, ooh, Rhaenyra turning away when Daemon went in for a kiss? Has she still got Mysaria on the brain, I wonder? Point number 25, in Fire and Blood, since Adam and Alin's mother Marilda claimed they were the bastard sons of Laenor Velaryon, when Adam claimed sea smoke, Corlys had both Adam and Alyn named Velaryons. And while it seemed the show was setting up for Corlys to name Alyn heir to Driftmark, whereas in Fire and Blood he names Adam, we instead get the subversion of Alyn throwing any help from his absentee father back in his face. Point number 26, in Fire and Blood there's no mention of Alicent secretly travelling to Dragonstone to speak with Rhaenyra to ask for herself, Helaena and Helena's child, or children in the book, to be allowed to live in peace away from King's Landing and its politics, and she never agrees to allow Rhaenyra to publicly execute Aegon. Point number 27, I love that the show acknowledges that the written history might not accurately reflect what actually happened, with Rhaenyra saying,
"History will paint you a villain,"
explaining why the show isn't a one-to-one retelling of Fire and Blood, because Fire and Blood might not even be itself a one-to-one retelling of what actually happened during the Dance of the Dragons. Point number 28, the very blue dragon flying over the marching Hightower army is Viserion, whose rider is Daeron Targaryen. Point number 29, and the wild dragon Rhaena finds in the Vale is called Sheepstealer, but in Fire and Blood it isn't Rhaena who claims Sheepstealer, but another dragon seed on Dragonstone called Nettles. But not before Silver Dennis tried to claim Sheepstealer and got his arm bitten off for his troubles, then Dennis and his sons were eaten by another wild dragon. It seems the show has replaced Nettles with Rhaena, giving us one less character to convolute the narrative, whilst also giving something for Rhaena to do, since in the books during the Dance of the Dragons she spends it all in the Vale doing pretty much nothing, and it seems likely that Sheepstealer is the 7th mysterious dragon in the opening credits. Point number 30, no idea where Otto has been imprisoned or by whom, since in Fire and Blood that never happens to him, though I'd like to think he's actually being kept in the black cells of the Red Keep in King's Landing under guard by those loyal to Larys. Point number 31, I love the juxtaposition between Rhaenyra and Alicent here, with Rhaenyra being surrounded by scrolls showing how she is a major part of history but is also trapped by it, whereas Alicent is outside and free. To round all this off, my most disliked part of the episode goes to how Aemond treats Helaena. Leave this delicate ray of sunshine alone, you monster. And my most liked part of the episode goes to all the interactions between Lohar and Tyland. I wish we had more of Lohar this episode. I think he/she might become one of my favourite characters. Thank you all for watching Triple S Breakdowns. If you enjoyed the video, please give it a like. Don't forget to subscribe, and why not leave a comment below with your feedback and anything that I missed but you noticed. I would love to hear from you all. I've been Triple S, you've all been amazing, and I shall see you all in the next video.